Wonderful. Okay, hey everyone. So this is like many other presentations, I'm sure, a fairly last minute presentation. So if I look surprised by the slides I run into, that is by design, let's say. So I'm talking about the reconstructing of hollow roots in Proto-Arabic, specifically the verbs, but we'll talk a little bit about the nouns as well. Um, Before we get into that, it might be worth kind of looking at what hollow verbs look like in textbook classical Arabic. Textbook classical Arabic is a term I've been using to talk about the classical Arabic that you might find described in Wright or Fisher standard grammars that everybody uses, but really only capture a tiny percentage of the amount of phonological and morphological variation that exists within classical Arabic as described by the Arab grammarians. But it's worth kind of going into this. Basically, for hollow verbs, there's three types of classes. You have the qama type verbs, which have qama, qumtu, qawm, so with a ao showing up in a verbal noun, but with a long a in the three singular masculine and all the long forms, and a short u in the one singular and other forms with a consonant initial suffix. Then you get the sara sirto, and those have in the verbal noun sayr. And then you have khafa khifto, which basically works as sara sirto, except that in the verbal noun, wa shows up, khawf. So this is the standard system. Um, but this is not the only system that is described. If we turn to Sibawai, and not just Sibawai, I mean, it's really any grammarian that we look at. If we look at Al-Farah, or even as late as Zamakhshari, we find these kinds of descriptions. Sibawai says about these hollow verbs that they apply imala to the a for everything where the root is a wa or a ya as a second root consonant, as long as the first consonant of the first singular form is followed by an e. And that is, for example, gefa, because you say giftu, طيبة, because you say tliptu, heba, because you say hiptu. And he also adds, they say meta, and those are the ones that say mittu, for I died, instead of muttu, which are two variants there that exist. Typical Sibawai style, without being explicit why he is adding this in the second sentence somewhere else, but that's certainly why he's saying this. And so what he's describing here is indeed a difference. Imala is the pronunciation of as a. And what he's describing here is this a showing up in a specific context, right? Depending on what the one singular form looks like, at least in his description. And okay, that doesn't really show up in our textbook classical Arabic descriptions. People don't usually seem to be aware of it at all. But it's not just a grammarian fiction. When we turn to the recitation of the Quranic text, very often people simply open up their print Qurans and find nothing of this sort. But besides the most common print Qurans that we have today by Hafs and Asim, there are, let's say, 9 other reading traditions. One of these is Hamza, who is equally canonical, equally accepted for recitation. And Hamza, he died in 156 Hijri, applies this kind of imala to 10 of his hollow verbs, and indeed all work as described by Sibawai. So he says je'a because of je'tu, she'a, zeda, rena, khefa, teba, kheba, heqa, deqa, and zera. Strangely enough, not meta, he died. You can ask me about that if you're interested why that's happening. So really, this is a part of the classical Arabic. This is part of what people considered proper Arabic, at least in the 2nd century Hijri, even though it's not described in our modern textbooks. I thought it was worth pointing that out. What's important here is that this a contrast, even though by the grammarians themselves, so the so-called imala, is considered a subphonemic thing. They see it as a variant of the a. That's not an analysis that works very well here from a modern linguistic perspective, because we can actually find minimal pairs. You have words like Sara, to leap, and Sera, to move, which clearly are only distinguished by the vowel variant. And this has implications for how we reconstruct Proto-Arabic and even how we understand Proto-Semitic. Unigard, talking about Central Semitic, reconstructs both hollow verbs exactly the same, would reconstruct both with a long a. He suggests in a footnote, and also later in 2019 he brings it up again. He thinks that sawara and sayara were probably the original shapes of these verbs at some point, but they had already collapsed to a long a in a Proto-Semitic stage. But if we would do that, if we would assume that in Proto-Semitic we have Sara and Sara, there's no way to arrive at Sara and Sera, which is a minimal pair that the grammarian descriptions seem to suggest. Now, Rabin in 1951 already seemed aware of this and indeed concludes that whatever Arabic form of Arabic this is, this Arabic seems to have a phonemic distinction between a and a, but he says, well, this is just a analogy. So he says, since a and a correspond to u and i, you have zurtu giftu and zara, so gafa should become gefa. But there's really no basis to equate a short e with a. There's no other places in the morphology of Arabic where a short e turns into an a. So this kind of analogy really doesn't make all that much sense to me. And I don't think this is the good way to go about it. So we have a phonemic distinction in a form of classical Arabic. And with minimal pairs and everything, and this must have some kind of historical background. And I will argue that Proto-Arabic must have had uncontracted forms of these triphthongs, so that indeed these verbs were probably something like sawara and sayara, and only at a later stage they contracted. And we'll go into some of the evidence for that. So first of all, a very important reason to think why they are not contracted is because in Safaitic, which is a dialect of Old Arabic, Ahmed al-Jalad has shown they do not seem to be contracted. We actually see verbs like bayata, he spent the night, which corresponds to classical Arabic bata or beta, and awada, he returned, for classical Arabic ada, and mayata for classical Arabic mata or meta. And well, you might wonder, well, maybe these are just ways of writing vowels, long vowels, but really that doesn't seem to be the case. I think Al-Jalad makes a very compelling argument that y and w are not juris mater lectiones in Safaitic. Even word final u, e are not written with wow or ya, and that would be the first place where you'd probably consider them to show up. So really, it seems pretty obvious that there's a triradical reconstruction here, and that's already something that Dr. Al-Jalad has already argued for, but I think we can see a nice trace of this in classical Arabic as well. So one thing that you might wonder is, well, couldn't we just write a rule that says a triphthong of, say, awa becomes long a and aya becomes a, so w just leaves contracts the thing to a long a vowel, while a y there contracts the triphthong to a long a vowel. And this is not possible because we have these verbs, and there's a couple of these. It's not just these, there's a couple of more. We have gefa, giftu, but gauf. Clearly, the root medial consonant originally was a w. So it seems to be that it's something like chawifa became chafa, and not. And if it would have been chawafa at some point, it wouldn't quite make sense, and you wouldn't expect a vowel there. So this sound law doesn't work. It doesn't work for meta either, because once again the root medial consonant is a wow and not a ya. So it can't be the wow or the ya in the roots. That's important. So that's not what is causing these vowels to appear in two different ways. Another option that you might consider is that it has nothing to do with medial semivowel, but the vowel in the second part of the roots. So say that it was originally kawuma, which became kama, but in a closed syllable you get kawumtu, which becomes kumtu. So close by a syllable. I believe this was Benjamin Suchard in 2016 suggests this possibility. And then this would actually solve all the problems. You get kawuma becomes kama, sayra becomes sayra, and chawifa becomes gefa, simply ignoring the value of the semivowel and only accepting the value of the vowel that follows originally. But this leads to a kind of strange situation because the verbal classes that you then get in the hollow verbs don't look anything like the normal verbs, and we're trying to kind of get a triradical reconstruction of these hollow roots, and you kind of end up with an issue. It works very nicely for Khawifa Yikhafu, which nicely aligns with Shariba Yishrabo and these kinds of forms. But forms that have a u vowel in the imperfect, you would expect to have an a vowel in the perfect, like kataba yaktubu. So you would actually expect qawama yaqumu and not qawuma yaqumu. And the same is with the e vowel in the imperfect, daraba yadribu. So you would expect something like sayara yasiru and not sayira yasiru. So they have both u vowels, both e vowels, in a place where normal triradical verbs would never have that. So how do we make sense of that? Well, I suggest 3 developments. I would say pre-Proto-Arabic, maybe Proto-Arabic, I'm not sure, but pre-Proto-Arabic certainly, we did simply have qawama, sayara, and khawifa, with a vowels in the perfect for the first 2 verbs and an e vowel in the second one. And the first shift we get is awi to ayi, so khawifa becomes khayifa. This is actually has some evidence for it, going for it in Safaitic, because the verb to die, which would also fall in this class, mawita, indeed shows up written with a ma-yata, so mayita. So that would be the first shift. So just w in front of e shifts to ya. That makes good sense and has parallels elsewhere in the language. Subsequently, the old awa and aya triphthongs, so the triphthongs that we would expect, simply shift to awu and ayi respectively. So we get qawama becoming qawuma and sayara becomes sayira. This step could alternatively be explained through analogical leveling. I think I like a sound law better in this case, but take your pick. And next up, we basically get the same law, sound law that was already established by Suchard. So qawma becomes qama, but when it's in a closed syllable, it becomes qumtu. Sayira becomes sayra, sirtu in a closed syllable. And khaifa, which it is now, becomes khaifa and khiftu in a closed syllable. Now, there's some reason to actually think this based on the hollow nouns. Siboi also reports that hollow nouns have an a, but here he says you don't look at the first singular form of the verb because you can't, because there's no first singular form of the verb. You simply look at what the root medial consonant is. It's very rare in nouns, and that's simply because of the shape of the noun, which is kind of rare. But we have a couple of examples. One of these is aib, disgrace, which exists besides aib, but aib is one of the words that shows up and is specifically mentioned by Siboi. This is a verbal noun. Verbal nouns have a couple of possible shapes. C-A-C-C, C-I-C-C, C-U-C-C show up quite commonly, and C-A-C-A-C. The only one that could reasonably be an outcome of that is the C-A-C-A-C pattern. So ayabun or ayab becomes aib. This is very nice because this shows that having 2 vowels, 2 a vowels with a ya in between indeed yields the a vowel, which is exactly what we would want. And another example of this is nib, canine tooth, also mentioned explicitly, is a body part, might actually have an e vowel in the second syllable, so probably from nayib, similar pattern as ketif, kebid, rahim, etc. Not quite as sure, but the verbal noun is quite clear. On the other hand, nouns that have a vowel in the middle and have 2 a vowels on both sides at least would certainly give an a vowel. So you get dar from dawar, probably originally dwelling. So there's a nice distinction between these, and they're quite rare to get these nouns with an a vowel in there, but when they do show up, they make sense with the sound laws that we have, and indeed aya seems to yield a, which is good. Some nice parallels show up with this. Meta is a kind of a weird class within the verbal system of Arabic because its perfect looks stative, so it has e vowel in the second vowel slot, mawita originally, to meta, while the imperfect looks active. You get yamutu and not yimatu as you might expect. This is paralleled by Hebrew, actually, because Hebrew has a nice mith, but imperfect yamuth. I just realized that I haven't checked these forms, but I hope they're correct. But I know at least that there's a and o vowel there, which is the important part. Mith, yamuth. With indeed a inexplicable a, because other hollow verbs don't work like this. Like qawama seems to give qam, but mawita seems to give mith, which looks very similar actually to what we see in this form of Arabic. But something we don't see in this form of Arabic, but we do see in Hebrew, is that also when there's an u vowel, you get an o at the end. So bawtha becomes bosh, as shown apparently in the future in 20,160 by Benjamin Suchard. He will live long. That's nice. There's a nice parallel. I think Suchard already showed very nicely that the triradical explanation is the best way to account for the Hebrew hollow verbs as well. So combining this with Arabic and the Safaitic evidence, which I think is very compelling, I think a triradical reconstruction for the hollow perfect, at least for West Semitic, is the way to go. So to conclude, triradical reconstruction is really the best explanation for this A versus A. There is a phonemic distinction between A and A in classical Arabic, not the classical Arabic of our textbooks, but yes, the classical Arabic of the Arab grammarians. They don't say it's for all varieties, but it's clearly being used. It is part of the classical language, at least up until the 2nd century Hijri. This is best explained as the outcome of triphthong collapse. And to sum up once again, awa would yield a, aya or ai or awi originally all yield a. And with that, I thank you.